Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
And we're back. And Aaron, not only did we kick off doing the show now in video as well as audio, but we keep cranking along here in Q2. We are the year is going along. There's a lot going on new. How you been, man?
Yeah, it's good. It's good. As we hit record on this, we are getting ready to get into conference season for the spring, right? We had KubeCon EU here recently, and there's a bunch of things coming up, and then you've got cloud earnings coming up. So there's, it's really picking up.
Yeah, no, it's going, and I think one of the things that we want to dive into today, not so much having to do with kind of cloud earnings or anything, is there is. It feels like a new level of accountability is happening as we've come out of the pandemic. Companies are trying to kind of figure out where they are, and whenever that happens, what you get into is this challenge between the business leaders, people that are creative, they're never not coming up with ideas. They're never not trying to find better ways to improve the way they work with customers, create new differentiation in the business, whatever it is. So there's this constant kind of demand for, we want to put things out there to help work with our customers. Those demands are always technology driven. And then you run into challenges of like, well, how are we going to get that website built? Or how are we going to integrate that service that makes it, easier and better to use and so forth? And ultimately that comes down to, can you build better websites, better front ends, integrate AI? And today I think we're really going to kind of dive into, how are people making all that better? What's possible, especially now that we're kind of in this age where accountability is more important, but the demand on speed and other things hasn't slowed down at all.
Yep. Yeah, agreed. And along those lines, we'll go ahead and introduce our guest. Our guest today is Malte Ubl, CTO at Vercel. So first of all, Malte, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yes, absolutely. And give everyone a quick background on your time at Vercel and also I think your time at Google Search. It's super interesting.
Happy to. Yeah, so again, my name is Malte. I've been with Vercel for a couple of years, but I have been following the company for ages. The founder, Guillermo, actually spoke at my conference that I used to run for 10 years, JSConf EU, and he was there in 2010. And we've kind of kept in touch, and I always kind of knew I was going to work for him. So eventually I did. Almost the entire time in between, I was at Google. There, I kind of started on the front-end infrastructure team, and obviously that's kind of relevant today as well. And it brings kind of me into a connection to the work at Vercel, where I built a framework called Wiz that's used for all Google consumer-facing applications as the front-end framework. Coincidentally, actually, last week, Google for the first time really officially talked about it, which was kind of interesting and exciting. But yeah, going on from there, eventually I ended up working for the search engine. I retained that kind of infra head. I was the tech lead for search rendering across all platforms, but I was also the eng director for search on desktop. So I got the kind of consumer application angle in my veins. And that kind of really brings a good connection over to Vercel, where I'm just kind of like, my personal mission here is to bring that kind of fidelity of running a front-end application to the rest of us.
Yeah. Well, let's start with some basics for, if our audience isn't living with this every day, or there's some, where does the front end start? Where does the back end start, and so forth? How do you think about having worked on a number of things that are customer facing and obviously have to do things at scale? Like, how do you think about what the front end is? What's the most important things with the front end? And then, where does sort of front end from an application perspective stop, and where does front end from a cloud, kind of CDN type of thing start? Or, where are those lines as you think about things?
Absolutely. It's a good and important question, because there's lots of misunderstanding. And this word front end, it has by definition, no well-defined meaning, somewhat ironically, right? Because it's a relative term that, front end implies a back end, and anything that has kind of some form of pipeline technology has a front end and a back end. At Google, we used to always joke that we're all just big table front end engineers. And so in a very similar way, I actually have a blog post about this on my blog that kind of tries to define the term. And what I end up doing is I distinguish between lowercase front end and uppercase front end. So when we at Vercel say front end, we usually mean the uppercase, right? Which is the stuff that's kind of related to serving end users, which might be like an internal application, your internal employees, but like, so there's real people. But we do include kind of the stuff that runs on the client, but also the server and the infrastructure that is directly involved in serving those clients, right? So that's both the application server that might be doing server-side rendering that talks to some backend APIs, and it might be services that are, technically backends, but like in de facto very much only there for front-end concerns. A good example is, for example, like image optimization, right? But then, on the lowercase front-end side, like if you have an API server, it has like the component that maybe does the routing and like talks to the client, which in itself, might be some kind of service, right? So I think like certainly in my heritage, I call that a front end, right? But it might be very, very deep in a sophisticated service-oriented architecture. So that's, again, like this is a confusing term, but like I think the uppercase front end definition that we use is everything from the client and then the services that run on the server side that are specifically designed to talk to those clients.
Yeah, makes sense. No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I also wanted to maybe take that one step further because it does remind me of, it's always like, we have a cloud. Well, what does cloud mean, right? So once you have to define all of that and once you come up with what it means in the context of this, what is the big problems a lot of organizations out there are trying to solve? Like it is one of those, it's like, okay, why do I need this? And how do I break this up? And where are those, demarcation points? And tell everyone a little bit about that and in the context of solving the problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've been using this word front-end cloud to kind of establish a category for what we're doing. You already mentioned this term CDN, and Vercel is not just a CDN. We include a CDN service, but the CDN is basically the true network edge, the servers that actually talk to like an end user client on the other side of the pipe, and but they don't traditionally include the application hosting part of the equation. And so the service spectrum of Vercel is that we do both the CDN layer, but then also the application hosting. And I think what we found is that in many organizations, when that might be pretty sophisticated when it comes to their cloud stack, it's still really common that those cloud like deployments that are really designed for backend concerns, where maybe availability is really, really important. And so I might be multi-AZ, but I haven't made the jump for worldwide deployment, right? Well, on the other hand, if you deploy your application to Vercel, you're automatically in 18 data centers. Just by default, there's no extra overhead. And we are making that, extra effort because that is really important for the user experience. But it might not be, something you prioritize if your job is to keep a service stable and doing really well connecting to your, database that might also be only in one region. Right. So we really see this opportunity for having like a dedicated cloud like system that's designed for those end user concerns rather than like the traditional kind of back end cloud concerns.
Yeah, I know when we first sort of started following Vercel, and it's been a number of years, we had a very good friend who was literally building an insurance company and was very focused on sort of getting out of the business of managing their own third-party services and really just only focused on the core of their business. How do you find when companies come to you? Because the way we've always had Vercel explained to us was it is a very different experience. And I don't mean that like in a difficult way. I just mean like the things that you have to stop thinking about, grow, right? It just takes a lot of burden off of your hands. How do you find that most people sort of think about their application versus, third-party things that are enhancing their front end and where Vercel kind of comes into that picture of trying to, again, hopefully make those pieces simpler for people?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about actually two different aspects to your question. One is kind of summarized in this somewhat buzzwordy composable front end term, and the other one is summarized in the framework-defined infrastructure term, which kind of come to this question from two angles. Like the one of the big trends that we see in the industry is that folks are migrating their end user front ends, at least, from monolith, like for example, Salesforce Commerce Cloud, and content management systems like Adobe Experience Manager that kind of give you an all-in-one experience to go, for example, deploy content and then also serve it to end users. And that comes with like a very, very limited flexibility. Let's say right now you want to, ship some AI feature. If you have a vendor like Salesforce Commerce Cloud, you have to get on the roadmap and wait for it to deploy, and then eventually you get it, right? So what the industry overall is doing is go into this composable direction where they say, I actually like Salesforce Commerce Cloud, and I don't want to pick on them. Great service, right? But they're now an API, and I'm going to build my own application. People really like doing that in Next.js, which is another thing that we make, right? And so now I have this application that calls my previous kind of all-in-one system as an API, but I'm in full control of building my front-end application, and I can compose whatever service into it that I want. So that's one big driver where people kind of migrate from these like old monoliths, kind of shrink-wrap pieces of software that are out there. The other big angle is what we call framework-defined infrastructure. And I think that's something that, I actually gave a QCon talk about this here in San Francisco a few months ago, and went into substantial detail of what it really means. But it's a concept that we are championing at Vercel, and it works particularly well for front end, even though you can technically also do it for back end workloads. So the idea of framework-defined infrastructure is that, if you have a computer program, it's Turing complete. It's very hard to understand what it will do, right? Like it's hard to prove that it will halt. But in practice, people don't build these, fully generic Turing complete applications. What people really do, and especially on the front end side, is they use a framework. So again, like Next.js is one that we make, but there's dozens of them out there. And these frameworks really kind of constrain how you build an application. They say, hey, you have to make a file here, and you have to put this thing into the file. And so the insight that we had at Vercel is that the framework gives so much structure to the program that we can infer from the program what infrastructure it needs. And that's why if you deploy to Vercel, you just give us your app, and we will look at your app and say, okay, I understand what you're doing, and I understand what I need to deploy to get this app deployed. And then there really isn't a way to even change that. And, so what you see is that we have pretty large customers, like customers who make hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue on the web. They have these super sophisticated applications. And if you look at their source code, they don't mention the word Vercel once, right? Even though they're deployed on thousands of machines worldwide and in a very sophisticated setup, because we have this, like, using the framework that they use as source of truth versus something like a Terraform or CDK or anything like that, where you kind of explicitly say that's what you want. We just take your app and we build the infrastructure for it based on what you program.
And Malte, let me ask maybe a follow-up to that then, because this really got me thinking of this whole idea of like, okay, how much of this is build your own? How much of this is using a framework? How much of this is using, say, third-party services and integrations? The classic example is like Stripe, right, for payments or something like that.
Right.
How much, a typical customer today, how much of this is really build your own, or how much of this is just simply using a framework or a third-party service?
So I think the typical Vercel customer actually comes to us because they want to build their own front end, right? So it's a very common story, for example, that you are a Shopify customer, right? And you've grown your business, and now you're making like lots of revenue there, and you want to distinguish yourself from other Shopify stores. But you like Shopify. So once again, you turn Shopify into an API. You maybe still use their checkout directly, but the homepage, the product detail pages, the product listing pages, all that stuff, you built yourself as a Next.js application, and you call Shopify as an API to give you the data for the app. And so, there's definitely this service integration notion happening quite a bit. There's always some data source, and that's often an API. But the actual applications people build themselves, that's kind of the point why you come to Vercel.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit and focus on AI, because you guys have been doing some pretty amazing stuff with that, both in terms of trying to use AI to make it simpler for people to build front ends and all of the interconnectedness that goes there, as well as making it easier to sort of embed AI applications behind the scenes or as services. Can you kind of walk us through what you're doing in both of those areas? Because I think they're relevant, but maybe not necessarily always to the same people or the same developers, right? Trying to solve different sets of problems, sometimes simplicity, sometimes the power of AI.
Yeah, absolutely. It's generally our strategy that we work towards making folks really, really productive building software. And then we give them tools for building software. And so on the AI space, we have two, I think, really relevant technologies here in place. And actually one is implemented with the other. So the more kind of developer-facing application we call V0. V0 as in the thing that builds the V0 of your application. And the way to think about it is basically like ChatGPT, you enter a prompt. You can actually also upload an image of like a website you like, for example. And then you say, hey, make me a dashboard for my HR software. And then maybe you specify a little bit more of what you're actually doing. And then V0 will write you the React-based application for that dashboard. Now, it has no functionality, right? It's all just basically the pixels and the underlying HTML markup using an UI library for the more sophisticated components. But it kind of gets you started. You start with the idea, and then you immediately have something that you effectively only have to wire up to some backend service, and then and you get going. And so I personally find this really empowering because I'm like this backend engineer who spent a lot of time on the front end, but I don't really know how to use CSS well. Like I can tune it, but I could never go from zero to something that looks good, to be honest. And so V0 is like this thing that where I can just type my prompt and then I get something that's so close to what I wanted that I can then kind of go on from there. And so this is something we're working on as kind of our lead AI application that's both, I think, has been received incredibly well by developers, and on the other hand, kind of gives us a good use case to exercise us as kind of a deployment platform for AI applications. And that's where the AI SDK kind of comes in as what we are building as a building block for AI applications. And so I think what I would mention is that our idea is that AI applications are new. We don't actually, as a whole kind of set of engineers on the planet, we don't know how to build them. So we are not over abstracting, right? We don't want to give you this really framework for how to build an AI application, because people are discovering new ways to do it every day. And so this is definitely a relatively low level technology for interacting with LLMs broadly, right? It has one unique feature, which only launched maybe now 6 weeks ago. And honestly, I've never seen something quite resonate so well with developers. It really hit a nerve. And so what it does effectively is it allows you to do the following. You can register functions with the LLM so that at least some of them support function calling now. And the implementation of the function is a React component. So what that means is, I'll give you an example. Let's say you are building a chatbot for your customer support system. And the end user comes and says, hey, I want to change my password. And you can technically build that with an LLM. Maybe now you ask, what password do you want, right? And then you have to parse that out, and it's kind of really awkward. So what you can do with our technology is just register your changed password component with the LLM. And so when the user gives that query, the LLM can actually respond with your React component that's hooked to your backend, that's completely interactive and part of your application. And you can do that with every React component. Like we have, for example, an airline booking system where I say, I want to book a flight, and then comes back with your flight, and it looks, like on United.com, and you pick one and kind of gives you a seat selector, and all these visual things are kind of completely integrated. And that's really been, I think, a problem that people had, right? Where you the text of the LLM only goes so far. At some point, you want to map it to your domain-specific UI, and that's kind of the part that we are really kind of fixing as a glue between the UI and the LLM.
Nice.
Yeah, I was going to say that's super fascinating to me because, I can completely see how that connects the dots and really provides value a lot faster, because I think that whole idea of taking the code and then being able to visualize it on the front end, I mean, that's just game changing potentially. Quick follow up to that. So let's say you said like this, this V0, it's for initial creation kind of things, but what if you just wanted to iterate it of like, hey, make this thing green instead of blue, or like, is that a new prompt, or is it then like you take that and refine it in a different tool, or how does something like that work? Small iteration.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not like a one-shot tool where you give a prompt and then you either like what you get.
Yes.
You can iterate on the output either by prompting against it. So saying like, I want the background green, that you could do that. There's also like a little picker where you can say, maybe you pick on the button and you say, change the label to X. We actually also allow you to just change the label, right? Like not everything has to go through AI for these simple text things. So yeah, you can absolutely iterate on it. But the idea is, and I'm not saying this couldn't be different in the future, but like one of the insight I think that we had when it comes to the changes that AI make to software development is that copy and paste, which used to be frowned upon, is actually not a bad way of maintaining software for certain things. And it's in particularly, and I don't want to get too in the weeds, but it's particularly interesting for UI components. So I've been in this industry for 20 years, basically. And there were people before me who have been in the industry at least 10 more years, right? Like early 80s is when the first UIs came out. And we never really figured out how to really do UI components. And the solution that we think is the right one is to say, hey, you just copy paste them. Because the problem with UI components is they tend to need to be extraordinarily customizable. And at some point, they then degenerate into such a mess that the abstraction doesn't work anymore. And so it's much better to just say, hey, I'll get the UI components into my system. I can change them however I want, but if I don't, there's a CLI that kind of gets to update them as they evolve over time. And so we kind of really believe into this copy-paste notion, and that's why at the end with V0, we basically just give you a way to get the code out, and then you can iterate on it however you like.
Yeah, no, it was as I was playing around with it and looking at it, it did, and I don't mean this to come across the wrong way. It did sort of come across, or it had a certain feel of it. It felt like some of the low code tools where you're like, I want the most common things to be out there. I wanted it to be fairly simple to get there for those things. And then, the last 5% or 10%, you probably have to tweak it. But if you could get me 95% of the way there really fast, that felt really, really valuable. So, I'm curious, like, is there a part of that is sort of tended to feel like low code, or some of the sort of drop and drag tools that are out there, or is that very different than the kind of cut and paste you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's in some ways there's a relation. On the other hand, it's the opposite. So we like to call ourselves code maximalists, and I think that's actually the future. Like the future of LLMs is that there's going to be more code because it's easier to write and it's easier to maintain. So the cost of the additional line, the marginal cost of one more line of code goes down over time with the advent of AI. And so we're not about no code, low code. We're all about making code for you, right? But it takes so much constraint off the tool if it doesn't have to do the 100%, right? So V0, and that's why we call it V0. It makes the very first version of your app. It's meant to be used by people who are software engineers, right? And who appreciate that we give them the source code. And if they want something that they can't express in a prompt, then you just go do it in code, right? So that's really the idea here. It's not the idea to take away the coding part. It's just to make the parts of it that are particularly, hard because it's the 0 to 1 kind of problem, like making those go away basically as an issue. But then you're effectively on your own, and you can use your engineering skills to get to the 100%.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, listen, Aaron, we had a chance to dive into this. You know, I'm going to ask you the question of like, are you now inspired to finally update our website and make it simple and so forth?
Yeah, I'll see what I can do. Like, I'm pleasantly surprised. I mean, I will say this: if the tool is so easy, Brian can use it, then maybe we have a chance, right?
Well, listen, Malte, thank you so much for all the insight today. It's been good to sort of dig into a topic that we've been curious about and haven't had a chance to dig into as much. So we appreciate both the insight and sort of putting up with both our simple and mediumly complex questions. So if folks want to engage with the newer, the V0 stuff, what are you finding is the best ways to do that or best ways to be successful?
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of V0 is you can just go to v0.dev and start prompting, right? Absolutely zero barrier to entry. You don't even have to, like, there's a free tier. You can just get started, see if it does something for you, and then either it works or it doesn't work for you. I think I would really recommend folks to look at the AI SDK because it really kind of helps you kind of take that AI dream that you have and connect it to something that feels much more valuable than these traditional as in 1 year old kind of text-based applications.
Awesome stuff. Aaron, you want to wrap us up and take us home?
Yeah, absolutely. So Malte, thank you very much for your time this week, and for everyone out there, thank you very much for listening. And just wanted to say, if you enjoy the show, please tell a friend. Please leave us a review if you're able to, wherever you get your podcasts. For Brian and I, we're going to wrap for this week, and we will talk to everyone next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.